Music comes to podcasting. The latest from podnews.net with Libsyn. Stop dreaming, start podcasting.
It has taken 20 years to get to this point where we can have podcasts where we play music and the artists get paid.
Adam Curry has launched a music podcast called Boostergram Ball. For the first time, money from listeners is shared directly with the music artists. Listen on a compatible podcast player like Podverse, Fountain or Podfans, and money is sent from your balance directly to the artist as you listen. Using value for value, the amounts are up to you, and you can boost songs to give more to the artists you like. Adam won't be playing Tiesto or Golden Earring though, not yet anyway. The only songs played are those submitted to services like Wavelake or submitted directly to the Podcast Index with artist payment details. There's more information in the tech stuff coming up later, and Adam is a guest on the Pod News Weekly Review this weekend. Got questions about YouTube and podcasting? Here's your chance to ask Kai Chuck, YouTube's head of podcasting, a question or two. The best questions will make it to his appearance at Podcast Movement, being interviewed by OSHA's Jennifer Hahn. You'll find a link to ask those questions in our show notes or in our newsletter at podnews.net. The programs for Radio Days Asia and Podcast Day Asia have been published. The event in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia has a number of speakers, including me, plus the number one podcaster in Malaysia and Kim Treasure from Audacia and many more. The event is in early September. The EBU has published a 40-minute video on the future of radio and audio, recorded at Radio Days Europe, previously only available for EBU members. Andrew Davies from the Australian ABC interviews Magnificent Noises' Eric Newsom. Danish podcast translation company Podster is to work with Finnish podcast producer Sonoma Media. Podster will adapt a Swedish-language true crime show into Finnish. After criticism, the British Podcast Awards have lowered ticket pricing for the awards ceremony in September. Pricing is now tiered based on company size. Also in the UK, commercial television broadcaster ITV has renewed a sales partnership with Global and DAX for ITV's podcasts. Another AI-powered service providing summaries of podcasts has launched. This one's called Distill. And Earbuds has focused on blockbuster podcasts for summer, chosen by Ryan Pack. You can subscribe at earbuds.audio. It's time for some tech stuff, and Boostergram Ball, a new music show from Adam Curry, published its first episode last Friday. As the songs are played in compatible podcast players like Fountain, Podfans, Podverse and others, 90% of boosts or streaming sats go directly to the artists. It uses the remote item feature of the new podcast namespace, which even allows band members to split their revenue how they'd like. Listeners also see album art from the song and more details. It's still very early days, and there are currently very few systems set up to author the type of RSS feed that you'd need to make this work properly. Adam uses Sovereign feeds, which we link to today, and Adam will be a guest on the Pod News Weekly Review on Friday to tell us all about it. In another first, Boostergram Ball is using IPFS podcasting to host the show. For self-hosted shows, the biggest issue with podcast bandwidth, says Adam Curry, is that every extra listener costs money. And to combat this, IPFS pulls audio files from nodes hosted by volunteers across the world, falling back to your own host. The show also donates 5% of all boosts to IPFS, which is shared by those IPFS node hosts. Well, we're running a node, and we're also trialing using IPFS for this very podcast. And if you've heard this, then it's worked, hasn't it? A proportion of boosts from this show will go to IPFS node hosts. And a third of all podcast requests to open podcast analytics service OP3 are from IPv6 addresses, according to John Spurlock. Most podcast hosting companies don't support IPv6, however, due to issues with download measurement. And in podcast news, the backstory with Patty Steele is new from Premier Networks and the award-winning radio personality Patty Steele. The show is a bi-weekly short-form podcast featuring Patty Steele as she enlightens and entertains listeners with a journey through pivotal moments in history and pop culture. The Pen Pals podcast is now part of Will Ferrell's Big Money Players Network. The show is hosted by Rory Scovel and Daniel Van Kirk. What do you do when you can't solve a problem? Bill Gates says, I like to talk to smart people who can help me understand the subject better. He launched Unconfuse Me last week, and his first show features Seth Rogen and Lauren Miller Rogen exploring Alzheimer's disease. What in the World is new today from the BBC World Service, a daily news podcast aimed at 16 to 24-year-olds across the world. The show is less than 15 minutes long and is hosted by Hannah Gelbert. The corporation's BBC Minute, 1-minute news bulletin for young people, produced its last episode on December the 23rd last year. And Spurgeon Sermons, the official podcast, is new from Premier Insight, featuring the work of Charles Spurgeon, who died in 1892, who was known for making complex Bible passages and theological ideas accessible to anybody. It's hosted by Pastor Rick Warren and read by the late actor Paul Burbridge, and it's launched today. This podcast is sponsored by Libsyn. Are you ready to tell your story? Libsyn has an all-in-one, fast, easy podcast tool that allows you to plan, record and create your podcast today. Stop dreaming, start podcasting with Libsyn at libsyn.com. And we thank Libsyn for their support this month. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.